Hello, everyone. I have a question for you. Do you find yourself disclosing too much information to just anyone and everyone? How about, do you find yourself talking too much? Having to explain yourself, maybe to people that you don't need to or actually don't have your best in mind? Do you find that you are having to give excuses or explanation for simply stating your preference? What's that about? It is likely your boundaries, and we're going to find out why on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Welcome to Journey to Healing. Do you find yourself discouraged, troubled, in need of healing, but not sure where to turn? John Euler, a licensed professional counselor, is here to help. John has more than 25 years of professional experience helping people deal with the issues that keep them emotionally and spiritually stuck. There is help. There is hope. There is a God who loves you and wants to help you find peace and strength. And John Euler is here to help you find that on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Euler. This is Journey to Healing. Welcome back. We are doing an intensive look into the issue of boundaries so that we can help facilitate healing. We are actually doing a study on the topic of grief and loss, but as I have mentioned many times before, you cannot heal from the past very well if the current day situations in your life are continuing to be stirred up. So you have to be able to take care of what's going on in the here and now so that you can begin to heal and attend to those things that you need to, maybe that you are bringing into the present. I invite you to visit SurvivorSupport.net. Under podcasts, you will find an ever-growing repository of these programs. The hour program is cut into part 1 and part 2. I invite you to access those because those have set the stage for what we're going to jump into tonight. And in an effort to save as much time as possible, I'm just going to refer you back to that because we're going to now look at where we left off last time. And where we left off last time was we were looking at the full range of really toxic relationships, quite frankly. So I'm going to bring my picture back up there. I'm getting tech savvy these days. But where we left off was this. On a scale of not just 1 to 10, but +1 to +10, those are, in terms of relationships, those are reasonable and normal. As a matter of fact, let me bring back a reasonable relationship. Now I'm going to get my picture out of the way. Those of you that were with us last time, if you weren't, go back and access the podcast. Again, SurvivorSupport.net under podcasts. So we looked at what does a reasonable relationship look like. We addressed the little knapsacks. Each of us are supposed to carry our own responsibility. We are to carry our own load, not a burden. We described the difference between the two. A burden is something that is placed on you that you have no control over. It's handed to you through living in a fallen world or because of the actions of someone else. Our responsibility is our load. In the Greek, that comes out of the book of Galatians, where Paul says each man should carry his own load. The Greek word for that is knapsack, and we referenced Proverbs chapter 1 and chapter 2, 1 verse 3 and 2 verse 9, that references if we pray for wisdom, if we cry out for wisdom. And that really is only necessary when we're dealing with people. We only need wisdom when we are dealing with people. Let me bring there we are. So if you see the little knapsacks there, that is a reasonable relationship. Each person in that relationship is doing what is right, just, and fair. The working definition of that would be that each person willingly carries their own load, does what is right, just, and fair, naturally accepts their normal duties, So none of us get any brownie points for, taking out the trash or anything. That's just normal. Natural responsibilities and basic expectations. As a matter of fact, a case could be made that if our parents just do that, are they doing above and beyond what is to be expected? Meaning, if I, as a parent, if that's what I do, if I just do the bare minimum, am I really all that worthy of honor? Because what does it take to make a child? Not a lot of talent, quite frankly. Okay. Also, each person is being emotionally responsible. They are reliable and they are decent. We could go on describing the nature of that relationship. So what happens as the relationships start to become, as it were, dysfunctional? We looked at that. We're going to jump to what an unhealthy relationship looks like. I'll get my picture out of the way for a moment. As a relationship starts to descend into the negative, and there is no reason why a relationship should extend into the negative. Now, none of us are perfect, and we all have issues on occasion, but hopefully our conscience will cause us to regroup. So an unhealthy relationship, you can tell it's moved from a responsible or reasonable relationship, one and the same actually, to an unreasonable relationship. That is if people do not self-correct. So a reasonable relationship does not expect perfection, right? We all have faults. As a matter of fact, in the New Testament, it says, bear with one another's faults, meaning be patient with difficult people. That's actually sort of somebody that has some rough edges, but that's very different than someone who is purposely starting to cross boundaries. So when we look at a relationship that is starting to not just remain in a -1 category, but now has transitioned to an unhealthy or the next level, which is about a -2 to beginning -3, what's that look like? It is a constantly taxing and discouraging relationship. The other person is resistant to feedback. So now we are giving that information to them. If in doubt, dispel all doubt, speak the truth in love. Love is not nice. You can go back and visit a podcast called Mistaken Notions to find out, does God want us nice? And he actually doesn't. So the other person is resistant to feedback and inevitably makes you the cause of the problem. So this is not just human error. This is now becoming someone that is recalcitrant. They are not willing to budge. That's why they're going downhill. Nobody ever stays the same. They're either getting better or bitter, better or worse. Just because you haven't seen somebody in 20 years and they seem like they haven't changed at all, that's more superficial stuff. You talk to the people that live with them, and they'll tell you that, they probably have changed over the years. You go to a nursing home, and oftentimes, just shy of a cognitive issue, you can have degenerative illnesses, of course, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, but Alzheimer's, where the person starts to become negative, and that's understandable. But oftentimes, people die as they live. So if you were a selfish person in your 20s, and in your 30s and 40s and 50s, because people have made excuses for you, then you're going to be a selfish person in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, and you'll be the kind of person that the nursing staff talk about, that they really don't want to be around you. Okay, emotionally high maintenance kind of person, discouraging. Look at the complaints is discontent. It's always something, it's never enough. The other person justifies and rationalizes. Now, in our little drawing right there, you see that the one person has no knapsacks. Now, again, we've gone from a reasonable relationship with each person having one knapsack. That is the goal. Everybody to own their own stuff, no more and no less. So the goal of counseling, for instance, isn't to teach someone how to blame someone, because blaming is me taking my responsibility or my knapsack and doing what with it? Putting it on someone else. So if I am blaming someone, I'm actually an oppressor. I have issues. So if I end up being like this little guy, so you see the one on the right has no responsibility. As a matter of fact, I'll bring him up here. Eventually, that's a toxic relationship. Look at what we have going on. we have the person on the right owning and accepting no responsibility, and the person on the left accepting all of it. The green designates the little person on the left, their responsibility. Look at all the blue. And the problem is, and for purposes of tonight, we're going to begin to look at what causes that little person on the left to accept all that responsibility. Because I can assure you, if that person is owning another person's responsibility, there's going to be a lot of different contexts, a lot of different settings where people now are dumping. So we could have not just blue, but we could have orange that now is piled on, while that responsible person, so here's what we would call the overly responsible person. They haven't dropped their responsibility. Meanwhile, other people have put their responsibility on them. Now, ultimately, the question is, why is our little person on the left here accepting that responsibility? You can't control what another person is going to do. If they start to give you their knapsack, they can kind of go halfway until they hit your boundaries. If you have boundaries, you will be able to speak the truth in love and not accept their responsibility. But if they are able to manipulate you to where you don't have your boundaries, then you're going to accept their responsibility. And by the way, that is not loving. That is enabling or rescuing. And the basis of that, as we found out last time, is fear. In 1 John, it says that perfect love casts out all fear. So if you have a relationship where you are fearful to speak up, you do not have a loving relationship. You have a relationship that is a one-up, one-down relationship. If you go back and look at the podcast, the warthog assessment, and also how big of a pig, you will see defined what it means to have a one-up, one-down relationship, a dumpor and a dumpee. The dumpor is the one with no knapsacks. The dumpee is the heavy laden. So if a relationship doesn't correct itself, really if the selfish person, and that's really what this comes down to. So our little guy here on the right, in the unhealthy relationship, he doesn't have a knapsack, and over time he's been dumping, and so he's been manipulating by letting you see short-term results and happy moments and an emotion, and the person's an emotional black hole. So little by little, what's happening is this: the more someone is allowing themselves to become selfish, they are having to override somebody else's boundaries to where eventually we end up in a toxic relationship. We covered this last time, but just for review very quickly. I'm sorry, where did my... There we go. I'm going to get rid of my picture. There we go. I want to make sure. Okay. So a toxic relationship is one that is going to, of course, be poisonous to the soul. So the other person actually uses you to carry their load and strategically intends to ensure the relationship, it's not a relationship, but that's what people are calling it, that it remains the same. The other person has mastered the art of ensuring you accept and take their responsibility or take their stuff, right? So they're dishing out, you're taking it. The other person works to ensure things remain as they are, and that is why if you continue, let me bring my little picture back up. If you continue to wait, if you continue to give and give and give and tolerate and put up with, in hopes that you will finally hear from the other person, thank you, and it's your turn, you're going to keep waiting. Why? Because they don't intend to change the dynamics in the relationship. So you can keep hoping. And that brings up the nature of anxious relationships. Let me see if I can grab that one here. We talked about this one a couple weeks ago, where if you have somebody who ends up, get rid of my picture sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once. There we are. What creates a love-hate relationship? What creates a constantly anxious relationship for you? It's when you have somebody who is at a different level of basically a different level of character development by choice. So you want them to be with you up at a 10, and you are actually allowing them access in terms of intimacy, heart-to-heart connection, without having earned it or demonstrated that they are able, willing, and can handle it and are interested in. So the anxiety comes in as far as the frustration. So you'll see the red bars there, that the yellow represents anxiety, and we've talked about in the past that anxiety is simply just adrenaline coming from the fight-flight syndrome. Flip side of her is anger. So actually, we should relabel the anxiety as really what? Anger. So under your anxiety, those of you that are in counseling and have been given a anxiety disorder, the reality is this: though we speak in terms of anxiety, the best way to reframe your anxiety so that you just don't have to manage it the rest of your life is that you are actually angry. You are filled with adrenaline. It feels anxious, but you're not. You're actually angry. What are you angry about? You're angry that the person on the right is being given access to your life. You expect that you're treating them at a level 10. You're giving them the good stuff. You're giving them your pearls, your time, effort, energy, resources. You're trusting them. But why do you walk away so frustrated? Because you're assuming somebody at a very low level of trustworthiness is going to act differently just by you opening the door of your heart. And they might even be in the negative category. So oftentimes you end up having somebody in the negative, and so you see way up in the upper left-hand corner, you see the positive. Oftentimes what you have is this: you just don't have a level 10 and 1 relationship that becomes frustrating. Typically what you have is this: if on the right we could go into the negative, I should have gone into the negative. This is what you have. So we're going to say our person on the left is at a level 8, 9, or 10 in terms of trustworthiness, in terms of character development, in terms of how they care for people, in terms of how they accept their responsibility to do what is right, just, and fair. The person on the right has not. And so what you have here is a one-up, one-down relationship. The person on the right is dumping on the person on the left. If we were to see that, again, kind of the difference in gradations, the person on the left is at a 10, and the person on the right is even down below a 1. That is the makings for a love-hate relationship. That is the makings for a crazy-making kind of relationship. We're going to continue to look at the nature of the person on the right, but the question is this: since you can't ultimately control anybody else, the question is, what causes someone to begin to accept the kind of relationship that is going to end up being toxic, that's going to begin to be very hurtful? Why does somebody do that? Again, shame on the person on the right, and we will be looking a little more in depth at how to recognize the person on the right. But ultimately, you can only control yourself. So the question is this: if you find yourself in relationships that are frustrating, where you feel weighed down, where you feel taken advantage of, where you feel disrespected, where you feel like you can't have a voice, the question ultimately is, why are you doing that? Why are you in that relationship? And ultimately, there is a reason why. It may be that this has become habitual for you. It may be that this has been something that you've done all your life. I'm looking for a video clip. But it also may be that you have gone through some things early on. Maybe you've come out of a kind of family that almost scripted you to be like this. Churches are wonderful. I'm kidding. Churches create this kind of relationship. A lot of pastors do, because they don't understand the nature of the guy on the right. And so they'll give sermons to the people on the left with all the knapsacks, and they'll actually tell people this: that we have to just bear with the person on the right, and the person on the left just has to keep taking knapsacks, because that's how we love someone. We love them into the kingdom, or we just have to be patient. That is a distortion of truth, because Jesus said, do not cast your pearls before swine. When you have the kind of relationship, I'm going to look for it again. When you have this kind of relationship, This is not a relationship. This is a relationship with a pig. This is actually a relationship that with our little person on the left, this little person doesn't know it, but they're actually being disobedient. They're actually rewriting what the Lord said. The Lord said, don't cast your pearls before swine. Don't give the good stuff to a pig. And meanwhile, if you're taking the knapsacks, it's another way of saying you're giving. Each time you give to an unhealthy person, it is absolving them of their responsibility. So you can be dumped on in one of two ways, where the person on the right gives you what you don't deserve. So they give you criticism, they give you negative attitude, they make you responsible for their happiness, or they withhold. They kind of step on your emotional oxygen tube. And so you start dying in a pile. It's, let's say, the husband that becomes passive aggressive, and he forgets anniversaries, he forgets Valentine's Day, he forgets all the important things. He just can't remember. Or this can also be female. So my little stick figures are sort of gender neutral, right? So we looked at the movie Tangled. So this could be a parent-child relationship. You could also have the person on the right be a woman, be a wife, a female in a relationship. That can be just as damaging. So no gender gets a pass. So what happens when we find ourselves in that kind of relationship? We looked last time again at, as you start to move downward, you will find yourself going into the pig zone. Okay, Matthew 7 verse 6. We are not to deal with pigs. You're going to find pigs somewhere around about -3.5 into the 4. Another word for a pig is a dog. It comes out of the same verse, also the last verse of 2 Peter chapter 2. And Proverbs references a dog. Jesus referenced a dog. Peter did as well. Dogs ran the streets back then, 2,000 years ago. They were outside the home. Pigs were inside the home, but Jews were not to have pigs. So whether outside the home or inside the home, we need to make sure who we have in our inner world to make sure that we are not giving the good stuff to people that we shouldn't. Because Jesus said they'll not only trample your pearls, but they'll do what? They will turn on you. So the person on the right, if they keep going down, meaning if they start to find it easier and easier to give their responsibility away, placing it on someone else, they're actually violating their conscience. So what happens? They begin to end up having what's called a reprobate mind, one that, like metallurgy, it doesn't pass the test. It's not good for the purpose that it is originally designed for. And in this day and age, you add deviance on top of that. Now you have a very selfish, sexualized individual, and so now you can have the beginning of objectification moving downward to predation. The twisting zone is one that eventually changes the person in terms of their values, their morals, their ethics, and what they care about. So instead of loving people and using things, it becomes inverted. And so we will continue to look at the person on the right, but the question is this: since we can't control the person on the right, what causes us, if we are the person on the left, what causes us to do that? Well, it probably came early on. You were probably typecast, as it were. And one of the things that causes us to do that is a sense that we're not enough. We have to apologize for who we are. We don't feel like we can have our own voice, as it were, and therefore our own boundaries. So the trauma is anything that can become overwhelming. And if it happens early on, then a person doesn't have, especially a child, doesn't have a chance to work through that, because probably the big people in their lives are the ones that are either bringing it or facilitating it or not stopping these situations that are becoming trauma producing. So it just keeps happening. And so the young person begins to become compartmentalized, meaning they take their emotions, they shove them down, And certain things happen over time. And there will be indicators of that. And so what are a couple of the indicators? Because it will actually affect the way your brain works. Neurotransmitters come from the way the brain is processing, but you have neural pathways. Dr. Carolyn Leaf, a brilliant neuropsychologist, has an excellent podcast, and she looks into what is some of the basis of when someone finds themselves having to explain themselves or talk too much. What is the root of that?
Let me read the post first. So, over-explaining is a common trauma response for those who were often made to feel at fault at some age in your life, whether it was as a child or an adult. At one point, the desire to people please provided safety. It was like a coping mechanism. Please know it's not your fault for what happened, and it's not your job to regulate and boost other people's emotional state. Okay, so let's take that, unpack it, and define it and give you tips for managing it. Okay, so it's a common trauma response. Over-explaining is a common trauma response to something that's happened. We need to be trauma-informed. Trauma is an adverse circumstance. Complex or simple, there's different types of trauma. It's different for every person. There's different levels of degrees of severity, but it's still trauma. Trauma has happened to us, it will happen to us, and it is happening to us. So being trauma-informed is very important. And we have different ways that we respond. And over-explaining is one of those kind of responses. So there's 4 main categories of trauma responses, and I did a podcast on this recently. And the 4 main categories of trauma responses are fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. Over-explaining would fall into the category of one of the fawn responses. Fawning, where you're trying to people please. So when we people please, it's a fawn response, and over-explaining is one of those ways that we actually try to compensate for what we've gone through. So if you are over-explaining, it is part of the trauma response, the freeze trauma response, and it's in response to something that traumatic that has happened to you at some stage of your life, where you were made to feel at fault about something, where you felt that you needed to prove yourself, that you needed to be able to explain yourself, that you needed to be able to try and keep people happy by putting lots of words out there to try and help people to understand what you're trying to say. So that's just a broad explanation, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about what those mean. But before I do, I want to explain the difference between over-explaining and oversharing. So they're 2 different things. Over-explaining is we're using lots of words and lots of explanations and lots of things to people please for all the different reasons we're about to discuss, and I've given you the broad intro to that. Oversharing is where you're telling a lot of too much personal stuff, and you're not judging who you're casting those pearls of wisdom on. So, for example, like posting too many private things on social media, or you don't really know someone, you just met someone and you're giving them like a lot of personal detail, and that's oversharing. So they're different, but they both come from a place of toxicity and of an inappropriate amount of information and detail about your personal life. So over-explaining is explaining something to an excessive degree. Oversharing, on the other hand, is a disclosure of too much personal stuff. Okay, it's too much information and detail about your personal life. Okay, so then, now, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Okay, so it's a signal. We're doing something. Whenever we do something or feel something or have a perspective or have this pain, these related physical symptoms in our body, that category, those groupings, we're doing that in response to a non-conscious something. What is that non-conscious something? This thing, this toxic thing that has got a root. Okay, so we're interpreting the situation based on a toxic processing, based on a toxic root. So the over-explaining is coming from a complete distortion. The only way to fix this is to look at the over-explaining and become a thought detective, and to go back to ground zero, become a thought detective, to very objectively stand back and observe yourself and actually look at the pattern of over-explaining. Go from the pattern to the signals, And from the signals, that'll take you to the thought tree. Then you start the process of deconstructing and reconstructing this thought tree. And this is all the neurocycle. Okay? So it's the deconstruction process where you're deconstructing the thought tree. Okay, and you're going from the interpretation, which is toxic, to the incorrect processing, to the root.
So you can see that some of these issues on our part, if we're the person that accepts responsibility and we're overly responsible, there are going to be people, there are going to be pigs, there's going to be dogs, there's going to be fools, there's going to be predators, all one and the same pretty much, that can spot that a mile away and can begin to zero in on those of us that have that propensity, and then what are they going to do? They will take advantage of that. A lot of people feel, and we've heard the term bum magnet. A lot of women feel, and they'll ask, what is it about me? Do I just attract these kind of men? Maybe, because of why? Because over time, if you went through a lot of things as far as being on the receiving end of hurtfulness, maybe by big people in your life, that ended up crossing your boundaries because they didn't care enough to abide by their own conscience, they overrode your intuition, meaning they caused you to override your intuition and therefore made you susceptible to thinking it normal to allow people to override your boundaries. So that was set up early on. It goes deep. Carolyn Leaf deals with biochemistry and neuroanatomy and how it actually structures the brains. It structures the pathways of the nerves within the brain. Research has shown that oftentimes if someone has gone through a lot of traumatic stuff, that about 90% of their interactions in the here and now are the result of them projecting from their past onto the current and future relationships. That is the making of a self-sabotaging kind of relationship. They will bring about the thing they fear most and they don't know why. So on the other side of the break, we're going to look at what is it about selfish people? What is it about the pigs that allows them to spot those of us that have a tendency to take on too much responsibility, those of us that tend to people please? What is it about them that allows them to zero in so that they will begin the process little by little of giving you their responsibility to where you end up in an unhealthy and toxic and damaging relationship? We will look at that on the other side of the break.
Are you or someone you know a survivor of abuse and wondering where to turn for trustworthy help and insight into the effects of such abuse? Ever wish you had access to a resource that could help you continue your progress in healing? SurvivorSupport.net is that resource. Developed by John Euler, a seasoned therapist with years of experience working with sexual abuse survivors, SurvivorSupport.net is a one-of-a-kind resource to help you understand the impact of abuse and to help you understand the nature of those who harmed you in order to help you gain clarity and continue healing. If you are interested in speaking with John Euler about your situation or in having John conduct a consultation or a training for your church or organization, SurvivorSupport.net serves as a convenient method of contacting him. Our program, Journey to Healing, is made possible through the generous donations of viewers like you. There are many opportunities and needs that Survivor Support is attempting to meet, and your monthly support or one-time gift would be extremely helpful as we seek to meet those needs and opportunities. Simply visit SurvivorSupport.net and you will see the link to donate on the homepage. We thank you.